After 5 years of trying, I was finally pregnant, but right before I could tell my husband, he confessed he was sleeping with my sister at our favorite restaurant. Wesley and I have been married for 5 years now, and up until recently, I truly believed our marriage was solid. But then, out of nowhere, he dropped a bombshell: he had been having an affair. And not just with anyone, but with my own sister. You see, we're both doctors, and while that might sound impressive or fulfilling to some, the reality is a lot more complicated. The long, grueling hours, the emotional weight of caring for patients, and the fact that we are both deeply dedicated to our work have all added layers of difficulty to our relationship. Our marriage has never been flawless, but we always found a way to support each other through the chaos. Balancing our demanding careers with our personal lives hasn't been easy, and there were certainly times when the pressure of our jobs made things harder. But through it all, I never once questioned that Wesley was my person. I had no doubt in my mind that we'd be together forever. Then, just 2 months ago, something completely unexpected happened. I found out I was pregnant. When we first got married, Wesley and I were eager to start a family. We tried for a long time, hoping and praying for a child, but no matter what we did, it just never happened. Eventually, we had to accept that maybe it wasn't in the cards for us. Letting go of that dream was painful, but we threw ourselves into our work and focused on strengthening our relationship, trusting that life would unfold the way it was meant to. So, when I started feeling a little off, waking up nauseous, more exhausted than usual, I didn't immediately suspect pregnancy. At first, I chalked it up to stress or maybe even a bug going around at the hospital. Still, just to be sure, I took a test. And when I saw that little positive result staring back at me, I was completely overwhelmed. It was a moment of pure shock, followed by a flood of emotions: excitement, disbelief, wonder. After all these years, I was going to have a baby. I had to sit down just to process it, letting the reality of it all sink in. My first instinct was to tell Wesley. I knew how much this would mean to him after everything we'd been through. But he was away at a series of medical conferences at the time, and I didn't want to share such life-changing news over the phone. I wanted to see his face, to experience the moment together, to make it something special. So, I decided to wait until he got back. The day of his return, I had everything planned out. I wanted to surprise him, to celebrate this incredible milestone in our lives. I made a reservation at our favorite restaurant, the cozy little spot we always went to for anniversaries, birthdays, or when we just needed a quiet moment together. It was a place filled with memories, and I imagined the joy on his face when I told him. I pictured how this would mark the start of a brand new chapter for us, one that we never thought we'd get to have. But when I arrived at the airport to pick him up, I knew something was wrong. Wesley looked distant, distracted, like he was lost in thought. There was no warm greeting, no affectionate hug like usual. His expression was flat, his eyes void of the excitement I expected after being apart for so long. Instead of looking happy to see me, he barely acknowledged my presence. At first, I tried not to overthink it. Maybe he was just exhausted from the long flights or overwhelmed by everything at the conference. Wanting to lighten the mood, I told him about the reservation, hoping that a nice lunch together would help him unwind. But instead of appreciation, I got a sigh of irritation. Without even looking at me, he muttered that we should probably cancel and just go home. His tone was sharp, dismissive, like the thought of spending time with me was a burden. I was caught off guard. It wasn't like we had other plans, and after days apart, I thought he'd want to catch up. Still, I tried to reason with him, suggesting that since we'd probably end up ordering takeout anyway, we might as well enjoy a meal out first. After another sigh, this one heavy with exasperation, he finally gave a short nod, barely looking up from his phone as I drove us to the restaurant. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. By the time we sat down at our table, the tension was impossible to ignore. Trying to break the awkwardness, I asked about the conference, hoping he'd open up and talk about it like he usually did. But his answers were clipped, cold, and uninterested. Just one-word responses that shut down the conversation before it could even start. That wasn't like him. Normally, after these trips, he'd tell me about the people he met, the fascinating talks he attended, the new ideas he wanted to explore. But now, it felt like he was holding something back. Looking back, I realized the signs had been there for a while. Over the past few weeks, I had noticed Wesley pulling away, becoming more distant. But at the time, I didn't think too much of it. Being doctors, we were no strangers to stress, and I assumed his moodiness was just another byproduct of our demanding jobs. We'd been through rough patches before, and I figured this was just another one of those phases that would pass once things settled down. But as I sat across from him at lunch that day, watching him avoid my gaze, barely engaging with me, I felt a deep unease creeping in. Something was wrong. Still, I pushed those feelings aside. I had waited long enough to tell him about the baby, and no matter what was bothering him, I hoped that this news would bring him out of whatever dark place he was in. Maybe, just maybe, hearing about our baby would remind him of what really mattered, and we could share in this moment of joy together. Just as I was mustering the courage to tell him, just when I was about to share what should have been the happiest news of our lives, Wesley lifted his gaze from his plate. His voice was calm, eerily steady, as he spoke the words I never in a million years expected to hear. "I've been cheating on you." At first, the sentence didn't even register. The restaurant was buzzing with conversations, the clinking of silverware against plates filling the air. For a brief second, I thought I must have misheard him. I let out a nervous laugh, my brain scrambling for an explanation. "What?" I asked, almost as if I was waiting for him to take it back, to tell me it was a joke or some kind of misunderstanding. But then, for the first time all day, he actually looked me in the eyes. And in that same cold, detached tone, he repeated himself, this time with even more clarity. "I've been sleeping with your sister." The world around me seemed to come to a grinding halt. My face went numb, and for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My husband. My sister. Tessa, of all people. My own flesh and blood. The weight of those words pressed down on me like a crushing force, but my mind refused to accept them. I blinked at him, my voice barely above a whisper as I asked, "What do you mean?" Deep down, though, I already knew. I just didn't want to believe it. His face told me everything I needed to know. There was no remorse, no flicker of guilt, just an unsettling, emotionless stare. He sat there as if he were reciting some mundane fact, something casual and insignificant. Gone was the man I had trusted, the man I had loved for years. In his place was a stranger who had just set fire to everything we had built together. My chest tightened as my eyes filled with tears. I felt the betrayal settle deep in my bones, a sharp, aching wound that I knew would never truly heal. My voice trembled as I forced out the question, "When did it start?" Some part of me still clung to the desperate hope that maybe this wasn't what it seemed, that maybe there was some explanation, any explanation, that could make it hurt less. But Wesley, in that same disturbingly casual way, began to talk. He told me how it all started months ago, right after Tessa had broken up with her last boyfriend. She had been devastated, heartbroken, and in need of support. I remembered that time vividly. I had welcomed her into our home, wanting to be there for her, to help her heal. She was my sister, after all. I thought we were doing a good thing. I thought we were helping her. But I had been so blind. While I had been offering her comfort, Wesley had been getting closer to her in ways I never could have imagined. Yes, they had always been friendly. I had even found it reassuring, back then, how well they got along. It made me happy to know that my husband and my sister shared an easy connection, that we all felt like family. Never, in my worst nightmares, did I think they were that close. I sat there, barely listening as Wesley continued explaining, my mind spinning so fast it felt like I was going to pass out. The betrayal was too massive to process. My husband. My sister. How was this real? Suddenly, my stomach twisted violently. I felt like I was going to be sick. I couldn't take another second of this. Without a word, I grabbed my keys off the table and bolted up from my seat. I didn't care that we were in the middle of a crowded restaurant, that people were probably watching. I just needed to get out. I needed air. Wesley called after me as I rushed toward the exit, but I didn't stop. I didn't even turn around. I pushed through the restaurant doors, fumbling for my car keys with shaking hands, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It wasn't until I was speeding down the road, my vision blurred by tears, that I heard my phone ringing. Over and over, Wesley's name flashed on the screen. Not to apologize. Not to explain. But to scold me. He was furious that I had left him at the restaurant, that I had made a scene. He had the audacity to tell me I was overreacting. Something inside me snapped. I pressed the phone to my ear and screamed at him, my voice raw and shaking with fury. I told him to get a damn Uber and leave me the hell alone. Then, I hung up and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. By the time I reached our house, I was on the verge of collapsing. My body felt hollow, drained of everything but grief. I barely made it up the stairs before I locked myself in our bedroom, and that's when I broke down completely. Sobs racked my body, shaking me to my core. I cried until I had no tears left, until my entire being felt depleted. At some point, Wesley must have come home. I heard him knocking, his voice muffled through the wooden door, asking me to talk. I refused. I curled up on the bed, my face buried in my tear-soaked pillow, shutting out the sound of his voice. I couldn't bear to look at him, to hear another word from him. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and at some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the clock on the nightstand read midnight. The house was eerily quiet. Wesley had stopped knocking. My stomach churned with hunger, so I decided to head downstairs to grab something to eat. But when I stepped into the living room, I saw him. He was asleep on the couch, his phone resting on the table beside him. The sight of him lying there so peacefully, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shattered my entire world, made my blood boil. I stood there, my hands clenched into fists, my breath coming in short, angry bursts. Then, my gaze shifted to his phone. I had never done this before. Not once in our entire marriage had I ever felt the need to go through his phone. But that night, for the first time, I reached for it. He hadn't even changed his passcode. The same one he had always used. Because he was so sure of my trust. So confident that I'd never suspect a thing. Oh, what a fool I had been. My fingers trembled as I opened his messages. My heart pounded, dreading what I would find. But I had to know. And there it was. Photo after photo. Each one more gut-wrenching than the last. Explicit images. Flirty texts. Plans for their secret meetings, arranged with ease while I had been blissfully unaware. Hotel bookings. Conversations filled with teasing, laughing, inside jokes. But it was Tessa's messages that destroyed me the most. One of them read, "It's so exciting sneaking around behind her back. The thrill makes it even better." And another, "I swear, the sex is even hotter because of it." I felt my stomach drop. My skin turned ice cold. My own sister. The person I had grown up with, confided in, trusted with everything. And Wesley, the man I had once believed was my forever. They had done this to me. Together. And as I stood there, staring at the proof of their betrayal, one thought burned into my mind. I would never forgive them. Wesley had thrown our marriage away so easily, like it meant nothing to him. My hands trembled as I took out my phone and snapped photos of their messages, needing solid proof of what I had just seen. I didn't know why, I wasn't sure if I'd ever use them, but I needed to hold on to the evidence, to remind myself that this nightmare was real. Once I had what I needed, I quietly slipped upstairs and began packing. There was no way I could stay under the same roof as Wesley, not after everything. I refused to raise my child with a man who had shattered my trust so completely. My hands shook with every item I shoved into my bag, my heart pounding as I tried to hold myself together. When I was done, I got in my car and drove straight to my parents' house, a town over. They were surprised to see me show up so late, but I couldn't bring myself to explain everything right then. The words wouldn't come. So instead, I just told them I needed to stay for a while, and thankfully, they didn't press for details. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. Ever since that night, I've been staying with my parents. And yes, I'm in the process of separating from Wesley. After what he did, there's no room for forgiveness, no path forward. I wasted no time filing for divorce, there's no going back after a betrayal like this. My parents were furious when they found out, and they immediately cut Tessa off. She's no longer welcome in our family. They're ashamed of what she's done, embarrassed to even call her their daughter. Tessa has called me repeatedly since, leaving voicemail after voicemail, sobbing and apologizing. She keeps saying it was all just a huge mistake. But I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive her. Ironically, the strongest support I've received hasn't come from my own family, it's come from Wesley's. His parents were horrified when they found out. They didn't try to defend him, didn't make excuses. Instead, they took a firm stance, telling him in no uncertain terms that they were disgusted by his actions. They made it clear that they would never accept my sister as part of their family. It's like they finally saw him for who he really was, and they wanted nothing to do with the man he had become. For a while, I kept my pregnancy a secret. I didn't tell Wesley. I didn't tell his parents. It just didn't feel right to share such joyful news in the middle of all this chaos. But 2 weeks ago, after coming back from an ultrasound appointment, I realized I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I sat down with my parents, talked it through, and decided it was time to tell him. I knew the conversation wouldn't be easy. I had prepared myself for anger, for arguments, for all kinds of reactions. But nothing could have prepared me for the cruelty that came out of his mouth. The first words out of Wesley's lips weren't questions or concerns, they were accusations. He accused me of trying to baby trap him. He actually claimed I had done this on purpose, that I had gotten pregnant just to manipulate him into staying with me because I was jealous of my sister. His words cut me so deeply that, for a moment, I couldn't even speak. But before I had the chance to process that gut punch, he said something even worse. He told me he wished I would miscarry. He didn't want the baby. Didn't want anything to do with it. And he said it all so casually, looking me right in the eyes with not an ounce of guilt, not a flicker of remorse. My whole body trembled with rage. If I hadn't been pregnant, I swear I would have punched him right then and there. But I had to keep it together. For my baby. For the innocent life caught in the middle of all this chaos. I forced myself to take a breath, to steady my voice, and I told him exactly what he needed to hear. I wasn't trying to trap him. I didn't want him back. I had only told him because, as the father, he had the right to know. That was it. I wasn't expecting anything from him. The only thing I would require from him was child support when the time came. That was his legal obligation, and he wasn't going to weasel his way out of it. Of course, he tried to argue Wesley always had to have the last word. But I didn't entertain it. I just turned around and walked away. Later, I also told his parents about the pregnancy. Unlike their son, they actually cared. The moment they found out, they came straight over to check on me. They've been nothing but supportive ever since, assuring me that if Wesley refused to take responsibility, they would. They told me they'd make sure this baby was taken care of, no matter what. In fact, they were so angry at Wesley that they went a step further. They told me they were changing his inheritance. If he chose to abandon this child, then he would never see a cent of their money. Instead, a portion of what was supposed to go to him would go directly to our baby. I never expected that kind of loyalty from them, but they meant every word. A few days after that, I got another message from Tessa. Another apology. She said she hated herself for what she had done, that she had finally realized the full weight of what she had destroyed. She told me that after finding out I was pregnant, she had broken things off with Wesley for good. She swore she would never show her face to me again and that all she wanted was for my baby to grow up happy and healthy. I never replied. And now, suddenly, Wesley's behavior has changed. The same man who accused me of trapping him, who wished harm on our child, now wants another chance. Of course, he has no idea that his parents have promised to cut him out of his inheritance and leave part of it to our baby. No, that's not what's motivating him. What's really driving him is the fact that his entire world is crumbling around him. Tessa left him. His parents turned their backs on him. Even our colleagues at the hospital, the ones who used to respect him, have distanced themselves. Wesley used to be so sure of himself, so arrogant. He thought he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it. But now, he's alone, humiliated. And suddenly, after everything he's put me through, he's decided that he wants to be part of my life again. For the sake of our child, of course. That's how he's trying to spin it, as if he's suddenly concerned about creating a stable environment for our baby. When he tried to sell me that ridiculous excuse, I couldn't help but laugh in his face. Then, I looked him dead in the eye and told him exactly what he deserved to hear. I wasn't going back to him. Not now. Not ever. Of course, Wesley didn't take my rejection well. True to form, he twisted the situation and turned his anger on me. According to him, I was the bad mother. I was the one ruining our child's life because I wouldn't let him play happy family now that everything had fallen apart due to his own stupidity. He even went as far as to say he would make sure our child grew up hating me for breaking up our family. Breaking up our family. As if he hadn't blown it to pieces himself. Update 1. A lot of people have asked about my relationship with Tessa, wondering if there were any past issues that might explain why she would do this to me. Honestly, there's no hidden backstory. We had a normal sibling relationship growing up. Neither of us was the so-called golden child, and our parents loved us equally. We never had any major fights, no deep-seated jealousy, nothing that would suggest she was capable of betraying me like this. I loved my sister unconditionally, through thick and thin. Which is exactly why this cuts so deep. What she did to me is something I couldn't even imagine doing to anyone, not even an enemy. That being said, I am relieved that Tessa left Wesley after finding out I was pregnant. The irony of it all is almost comical. Wesley had thrown away our marriage, thinking he could run off with a younger version of me and live out some fantasy. But in the end, he lost her too. Of course, that doesn't mean I'll ever forgive her. But at least now, Wesley is truly alone. Update 2. A few days ago, Wesley actually showed up at my parents' house, still trying to fix things. At first, he tried to convince me, again, that we should get back together. He launched into a whole speech about how sometimes parents have to make sacrifices for their children, how our baby deserved to grow up with two parents instead of one. I had heard enough of this nonsense. I looked him straight in the eye and reminded him, bluntly, that not too long ago, he didn't even want this baby. That, for crying out loud, he had wished I would miscarry. And now he was preaching to me about family and sacrifice? He tried to backtrack, saying that maybe once he held the baby, things would be different. That maybe he would change his mind. His words were empty. Just like every promise he had ever made. I shut it down immediately. I told him, in no uncertain terms, that he had slept with my sister, there was zero chance of us ever getting back together. No amount of pleading, guilt-tripping, or manipulation was going to change that. But instead of taking responsibility, Wesley did what he always did, he flipped it around and blamed me. He said it was my fault he cheated. That I had stopped showing him affection. That I was too focused on work. That he had expected me to slow down my career after we got married, but I never did. I actually laughed at that one. Classic Wesley. Always the victim. Always deflecting. I reminded him that he knew exactly who I was before we ever got married. We had been co-workers for years before we started dating. He had seen my dedication to medicine firsthand. It was one of the things we bonded over. And yet, now, he was acting as if my ambition was some shocking betrayal. I refused to apologize for working hard, especially since he had been doing the exact same thing for years. Then, just when I thought he couldn't sink any lower, he started whining about Tessa. He claimed she had been there for him when he was feeling vulnerable. That I should have noticed he was cheating on me, and that if I had been paying attention, maybe things wouldn't have turned out this way. As if it was my fault for not catching him in the act sooner. As if that somehow excused his betrayal. At that point, I was done. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to stop trying to blame me for his infidelity. He was the one who had crossed the line, not me. And even his own parents knew that what he did was unforgivable. That's when he scoffed, his arrogance flaring up again. He said his parents loved him and that they would eventually forgive him no matter what. And that's when I decided to drop the final bombshell. I told him the truth. That his parents were done with him. That they had already cut him off from his inheritance. And not only that, but all that money was going directly to our baby instead of him. For the first time since all of this started, Wesley was speechless. I watched as his face crumbled, the realization hitting him like a brick wall. The usual smugness, the confidence, the arrogance, it all disappeared in an instant. And I won't lie. It felt good to watch him finally face some real consequences. After everything he had put me through, after all the pain and humiliation, this was justice. Then, like a true coward, he lashed out again. He started yelling, calling me vile, saying I had ruined his life. That he wished he had cheated on me sooner. I just shook my head and told him to leave. But instead of walking out, he got aggressively close, too close. His voice was raised, his face inches from mine, and for the first time, I felt genuinely unsafe. That was when my parents, who had been in the other room, trying to give me privacy, came rushing in. The moment my dad saw Wesley towering over me, he snapped. Before Wesley even realized what was happening, my dad grabbed him and punched him square in the face. Wesley stumbled back, disoriented, trying to process what had just happened. But my dad wasn't done. He grabbed him by the collar, dragged him across the room, and shoved him out the door. And as Wesley stood there, stunned and humiliated, my dad delivered one final warning. If you ever show your face here again, it will be the last day you ever walk this earth. And just like that, Wesley was gone. It's been days since that happened. For the first time in a long time, there's been silence. No calls. No texts. I think he finally realized he lost. Update 3. It's been 8 months since my last update, and I just wanted to check in for those who have followed my story. I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy daughter, and she's doing amazing. Wesley's parents have remained incredibly supportive. They set up a trust fund for her and continue to visit, but they've completely iced Wesley out of the family. They want nothing to do with him. As for Wesley himself, we're officially divorced. I have full custody of my daughter. He didn't even fight me on anything. He knew he had no case. In the end, all he was left with was a hefty alimony bill and child support payments. Tessa? She still sends me messages here and there, apologizing, but thankfully, she hasn't tried to push her way back into my life. Which, honestly, is the best gift she could ever give me. I don't know if she and Wesley will ever cross paths again, but frankly, I don't care. I've moved on. I'm focused on my work, on raising my daughter, on building a happy, healthy life. That's all that matters now.